Hey guys, Luton here, back for another episode of Below the Line. Now, I've been really enjoying doing this series, even if it does mean I sometimes end up at 6 AM in the morning still editing and trying to get this thing out. But I've been enjoying this series. I think it's a really good format. But with that said, I would be interested to hear, have you guys been enjoying this series? So far, the views haven't been the highest on this channel, but that's okay. You know, sometimes when you're starting a new thing and it's not what people ordinarily would watch, that's not a problem. It's how it goes. And I think that, you know, given time, maybe it will attract more of an audience along the ways. So, you know, I'm interested to hear what you guys think about that. Should we just continue on going with it, or should I just write it off as one of those things which is interesting but not really gaining enough traction? I don't know. I'd be interested in your thoughts about that, because ultimately this series, you know, it requires a bit more editing. I have to actually research the topics, I have to find out the information, and people are probably going to say, well, LT, you know, if you want to do it, then do it. I know, I feel that, but you know, maybe we should restrict this to a once a week, maybe twice a week is too much. I don't know. I'd be interested on your thoughts about that as well, guys. So today we are discussing the last topic, which was to do with the death of single player games and the way in which these big companies are starting to kind of align themselves toward producing games which focus more on microtransactions. And interestingly enough, you'll see where that goes with the topic for today. Now, first up, Robbie says, "Hey Luton, good video as usual. My 2 cents. I personally think that the big publishers don't want single player. They can't get enough money out of it. Look at the arcade era. How would they get there then? By making the game hard and tying lives to credits. Same thing with season passes. They were there to get more money up front, no matter how good the DLC is." The point about arcade games is an interesting one. I've seen some people link arcade games to modern microtransactions in that you're paying small amounts for things in a game. But the difference was, in an arcade game, you didn't own the primary existing game itself and then have to pay every time you played it. You had to go to the arcade to play that game, and then you were paying for a life. Now, to be fair, they did make it prohibitively difficult in order to ensure that you had to pay for those lives in the game. And isn't that very much like making loot crates, loot boxes, prohibitively, you know, like the alternative is grinding really hard, and so it becomes a pain in the ass, and then you think about getting a loot box. So it's not that big of a jump, is it? It's not that big of a difference between an arcade game and a loot box when you kind of boil it down. Now, there are, of course, a load of differences there, but in essence, it's about kind of making someone want to put their money into the game, you know. But the difference was, you were talking about, like, you know, 20p, 50p, a pound back in the day. Now you're talking about more money than that, whereas the actual price for games has stayed relatively consistent from, I would say, the 90s right up to now. That's actually another thing which is very shocking. Like, if you look back at the 90s, you'll see like full price games being like 45 to 60 pounds. It's the same price right now, which is unbelievable. Now, he says, "I do think devs and pubs need to make money, otherwise the game would never get made, and games would have died at the end of the arcade era. But how that money is made and in what context is it? That is the question," which is very true. He says, "I play World of Warships. In that game, there are loot boxes that you grind by gaining XP, or you can buy premium currency to unlock XP gained for ships where you unlocked all modules and then the next ship. You can buy loot boxes, but they're horrible, and to get the consumables and camouflage out of it, usually there is an event running where you can get the same things out of it." Now, almost all games from Wargaming are also free to play, which is a big point. They've got one game on Steam for €40. Now, I don't say that it's a perfect system, nothing is, but it's one of the better ones out there. So he thinks that single player games will be gone from AAA games in a couple of years, especially since companies like EA and Ubisoft are more and more focusing on their consoles. They're coming back to the PC, but it's slow, and they don't want to get on Steam if possible. He says, "I hope indie devs will take over the mantle of making good single player games." And I think that is a really good point. I think we are potentially on the cusp of a bit of a golden age for indie games right now. And I probably want to speak to some indie devs and actually find out their opinion about this as well, whether they're excited about this prospect and whether that translates to any kind of real data. TestTube says, 100 hours in a single player game. How about 1200 and counting, which is a massive amount for a single player game. Mountain Blade is a good game. These big companies just don't want to put in the effort. They'd rather make the quick buck with the easy to make game, hence all these loot crates and shit. Low effort, high cash. That's all they care about. I'm pretty much done with AAA game companies at this point, and I'll be focusing on smaller companies that still give a shit about the actual game. The second it becomes all about the profit, the games that they made died. Now, to a degree, not sure that's a fair statement to make, or an accurate statement to make. But I do think that there is a level of exhaustion now when it comes to microtransactions and this kind of crap. I feel like people are more aware of it. You might not feel it, but when you comparatively look back a few years ago, when even like somebody like me who's really cynical about these things, I was saying, oh, that won't happen. That's not going to happen. Because I imagined like, oh yeah, people will just throw their toys out the pram about it. But companies were smart. Companies were clever. They did it in a more drip, drip, drip kind of way so that people didn't really notice. And this is why I keep saying when everyone goes on about, oh, cosmetics, it's going to be right. The principle of cosmetics just being in a box or being available to purchase in and of itself, that isn't really a problem. You throw some cosmetics in and you go, yeah, okay, it's a way for them to bump up their costs, whatever. Yeah, fine, But the issue is that instead of it just being that, okay, because that's the thing, it's like everybody always says, oh, I don't mind cosmetics in games, like you can buy cosmetics in games, and everyone's like, that's fine, there's no problem. Yeah, you're right, there is no problem with that. The problem is that it doesn't stop there. It's like you give them an inch, they take a mile. And that's the thing. Everybody goes, all right, well, we'll let you have those cosmetic purchases in games. But then we're also going to do this. And that's where the problem is like they don't see it as just being like that one thing. They see it as like, oh, hey, this worked. So why don't we now try this and this and this and this? And that's where the problem is. Okay, Jira is back and says, single-player games are not dying. AAA is just changing its focus away from it. This was something I heard many years ago, back when Far Cry 3 came out and every other AAA company tried to copy their open world style gameplay. The only difference between now and then is the reason for it, and that's pretty key. He says devs back in the day wanted more open world games because it had players playing the game for longer. It's why Batman Arkham City had so many Riddler collectibles to keep players playing those games for longer and not play other games instead. Now though, with microtransactions being so profitable, the reasons slightly change. It's no longer to keep the players playing their game longer, it's to keep players playing their game longer, as that will then give a higher chance of them wanting to spend money on it. And if they do give in and spend money once, they then have a much higher chance of them spending more. That is a really, really accurate and very critical statement to make. He says ultimately, even if AAA did go away with single player, it would just shine more light on indie games, as they would be creating truly awesome single player experiences and stories, something that I've not seen yet in a AAA game in a long, long time, well, Last of Us. But that is where single player games usually shine more than any other game, stories, characters and experiences. Yeah, they're about the narrative. A horror or heavily emotional game isn't as impactful when you have friends around you splitting your attention, or in an open world game where the experiences is one minor side quest, or in the main quest you split away to do side quests first. But great stories, characters and experiences, that's already where indies shine best. If AAA went away with that stuff, it's just going to make those indies shine brighter, which is what I've been saying. Are we about to embark upon this golden age for indie games where everyone is like, oh my god, we're so sick to death of the AAA bullshit. Like, we'll go and we'll play that AAA stuff a little bit, and then we'll come back to the real meaningful, awesome indie experience. But again, the trouble is with this kind of stuff, it swings and roundabouts. It's not for everyone. Everyone has their own way of doing things. He says it's both a good and a bad thing, and to me personally, who rarely ever buys AAA games anymore, I would say a lot of people. I would say it's a good thing, as indie devs actually put their heart and soul into their games, making experiences so much better than AAA games ever could with much less resources, and they deserve some shining spotlight and money for their hard work. He says, heck, I don't think I've ever seen an indie game with microtransactions at all. They probably do exist. Why aren't you all throwing your wallets at indie devs more? It's a fair point, it's a good point to make. But you just have to be careful you don't end up with too narrow a vision there about what the state of play. Because a lot of people buy AAA games, a lot of people, because the marketing is there, because the money is there, because the big companies there, the distribution is there, the reach is there. You don't get that same reach with an indie game. You don't get that same reach even with very popular indie games. You just don't, because it's all about that kind of, that push, that connectivity. Why do you think that, Spin Tire's Mud Runner, now that it's gone with a publisher covering its back, okay, now it gets pushed out to consoles, because it's about that reach, it's about pushing out, and they want to see the return on investment. That's always what it's going to be about. Okay, Punk next had a good comment, but I'll just say again, guys, please, when you're writing comments, if you have a lot to say, no problem, but please can you format it? Just put a couple of return spaces in there, because not only does it make it easier to read, it also makes it easier for me to cut and lay out on a video. Okay, Punk says, loot crates can be the candy of a game's community. From my experience, CSGO boxes openings are one of the things that made that game popular. YouTubers, live streamers gamble on the internet, yet people seem to enjoy watching. What I'm trying to say is loot boxes with cosmetic items only, as looting is having concerns with, kind of attracts audiences and blooms the game related YouTube videos and live streams. From a business perspective, it is beneficial, as the game's title is becoming then more famous. For the consumers, I think the discretions and judgments of those willing or I think incentivized to spend money are also very important. If the consumers or players in this case put more thoughts and consideration before making that investment, there wouldn't be so many complaints. Luton mentioned a lot of loot boxes are and how they're addictive, like gambling, which can be a problem for some players and games, but if the players know how to manage their money and spend it with a conscience, I think he meant to say, the system wouldn't be so much to blame. For Battlefield, premium has to stop for a greater good. 70% of all maps and modes after the entire cycle of Battlefield games' lifespan being played or playable only by those premium players who paid additionally for the same price of the base game is a waste of production's time and resources. Star Wars Battlefront 2 got rid of the season pass, good, but the advantageous items in loot boxes is not so good. Battlefield games and no premium passes was also good. Battle packs with cosmetics and XP boosters only, just like in BF1, he says also good in his opinion. Also consider that battle packs can be earned just by playing the game, although apparently it takes quite a while, we've already seen. Players with consciousness or conscience in money spending wouldn't have a complaint about the system. Shortcut bundles are also good for casual and busy gamers, as Luton said. In the end, I think loot boxes with cosmetic items are harmless to smart players, but they can also be addictive and rips into an inconsiderate gamer's wallet. Now, there's a fair bit to sort of go in on there, but I think essentially the main part comes back to a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about is, you know, the opinion of loot boxes. The reason why I kind of included this comment is because it's interesting to see how people's sort of perspectives can be slightly different and how some people can see like, okay, well, you know, there are some positives to these things from either a business point of view or for those people, you know, those individual people. The question overall is it best for everyone overall? And again, well, that's a subjective thing. You know, you can't say if it's best for everyone overall. Some people don't care. And also, like, when it comes to how people spend their money, as I have said many times before, when people ask me, hey, LT, is this game worth getting? I always say, well, how can you answer that? You know, if somebody says, is it a game that's worth getting? Now, look, if you want to be really pernickety, that's where you come and you say, like, well, I can't possibly say that. But look, you know, reasonably, I might say, like, hey, Dirt Rally, it's on sale this week for £10. It's a bargain. You should definitely get that game. It's great. Depends how much money you've got lying around spare. Do you know what I mean? If you've got, like, you know, if you're earning like 200 grand a year, well, you're going to have plenty of money to throw away. Like, why would you care if the loot boxes were in a game? You could just, you know, you could buy 100 loot boxes, you know, you got plenty of money to throw at that, right? But if you're like, I would argue, someone who is just normal, like somebody who just has a normal job, normal life, and, you know, maybe spending out £100 on loot boxes is something you don't really want to have to do. So that's the thing, it's kind of swings and roundabouts, and there's always going to be people who benefit from things and people who it's going to be more of a negative for. But to a degree, you kind of have to make a generalization. You have to make a generalization and say, well, look, overall it feels like this is the vibe of where things are at, you know, because it's not an exact science. It's, you know, you can break it down, and even if it were, where do you draw a line? That's always a question about where do you draw lines, you know, sort of at what specific point does something become okay and not, and who gets to decide that? So, you know, it's all a very kind of organic, loose thing, and I think the best way of judging it is people's kind of reaction and people's awareness. Now, here's the thing, you saw the reaction to the loot boxes from EA in regards to Star Wars Battlefront 2, and a lot of people were really pissed off about that. To me, that signals that people are actually not in favour of these kind of things, but they just very often don't think about it enough. Now, if that had come up and everyone had gone, yeah, it looks great, love it, let's do it, we want this, we want boxes in the game. I love the excitement of gambling, I love the excitement of not knowing what I'm going to get in a box. You know, if loads of people have come out and gone, oh my god, EA have come up with the best system, it's like, it's really exciting. Not only do we get to play the game, but, you know, we have this opportunity to roll you know, potential chance of getting an exciting thing. We get to pay for that as well. If loads of people had come out and been excited for it, well, you wouldn't have a case to make, would you? But that wasn't the reaction. People were pissed off, you know? People were pissed off. And that's why I say, I think that the majority of gamers just don't think about this stuff very often. But then when it hits them in the face, they go, oh shit, I don't want this. I don't want this. And that's the point that I've been trying to make, is that this is a thing. It is something which really, really pisses people off, but they don't often deal with it until it's right there in front of them, because they're doing other things. And that's just like life. That's just like everything, you know, whether it be, you know, politics or finance or whatever. Often people don't want to deal with stuff until it's bang right in front of them, you know, because you think, oh, I don't really want to have to think about that. I'm too busy doing my life, because everyone's busy, everyone's doing things, you know, they don't want to have to think about all this stuff. But the problem is if you don't think about it and you don't address it, suddenly you turn around and you're like, oh my god, and then it's too late. And that's really the core nub of the issue. Okay, next up, Ollie Rigney says, finally LT talks about the topic I'm most pissed off about. I don't really play many online multiplayer games because I don't like the inherent competitiveness involved. I've got some friends that are the same, but I have not properly enjoyed a AAA single player game since Shadow of Mordor, and before that Halo Reach. I'm seriously upset with how shit single player games from big companies have been for the last good while, and I wish people would unbury their heads and realise that this is going to get worse if we don't do something about it. This idea that all games need to have multiplayer aspects to them is bullshit. The Assassin's Creed series started to go downhill after multiplayer was introduced in Brotherhood, along with other issues. I used to play the Call of Duty games for campaigns, but they slowly but surely got worse the bigger the multiplayer got. And the one thing that annoyed me the most was when people asked for the next Elder Scrolls after Skyrim game to have multiplayer, and Bethesda fucked it up and made an MMORPG, the exact opposite type of multiplayer than what people wanted. And another thing that, while isn't exactly a single player problem and more an offline gaming problem, is the disappearance of split screen from games, because according to someone from Microsoft, it's harder to get people together to play games. Pure bullshit. The greatest fun I ever had with any video game was 4-player split screen Halo 3, and I still do it when friends come over for a few drinks, pure unfiltered fun, but nope, split screen is gone from Halo now. I'd continue ranting for days, but spare my keyboard from angry typing and leave this golden age of AAA video games has come to a close. Indie developed games are the way forward. Again, I keep hearing this. I keep hearing people saying indie games are the way forward. Now look, all good points, but I think a few things I've got to say there about mainly split screen. You can't, you know, it's 2017 and I love old style gaming. I've been gaming for a long time. I used to play GoldenEye split screen. You know, I used to play a load of games split screen. Split screen isn't 2017. I know it sucks. I know that it means it's frustrating when you want to have people come over and play a game together and stuff, but it is true. I think that doesn't happen so much. You know, it doesn't happen so much that people come and do that anymore. It tends to be everything's online, and it's just one of those things. It's just one of those things you got to deal with. On the other hand, I will talk to the point about you know, a lot of gamers not wanting to play in a multiplayer aspect, and you know, it's an interesting thing. We went through a whole period where games used to be focused on like a really core single player, even Battlefield to a degree. I mean, the campaign elements of Battlefield Bad Company were pretty strong elements of that game, and then the Battlefield 3 campaign, I remember, didn't go down particularly well. Like, it wasn't sort of overly well received, and even the same with BF4 as well. But the point that I make is that we went through this whole time where it felt like single player was the main thing, or at least a strong focus, and then multiplayer was like another element. And you still do see that, like for example, like Last of Us. Many people forget Last of Us actually had a multiplayer element to it, which is weird when you think about it. It's like, why would you bother to add that? But yeah, it did. Last of Us did have a multiplayer element to it, which was a strange thing. So you do go through this kind of thing where it's almost kind of like an obligation. They feel like they have to add that in. You feel like you have to actually have it tacked on. And to me, that always felt like a waste of resources. I was just like, well, why bother to do that? Because it's got to be all kind of developed and worked out and supported and all this kind of stuff. But it's a selling point, because there's always going to be a part of the market who wants to have that element in their game. And so they kind of feel like, well, if we don't provide it, then it's going to be missing out. You know, we're going to be missing out on people that might purchase this game. Because for some people, like, the idea of buying just a single player game and not even having the option to play it multiplayer, that's probably a deal breaker. So by not adding it in, they're probably losing a lot of sales. I don't have any stats about that, but I'd be interested to know, and there probably is sort of data backing it up, because that's the kind of way that decisions around these kind of things get made. Okay, next up, Jim Knight says, not everyone actually wants to play multiplayer games. Many gamers love to play single-player games. And again, I'll allude to, you know, I've got friends like this. I've got friends who really enjoy games, and they really enjoy playing single-player games. They can't abide with multiplayer. They say it's too toxic, and they're not good enough, and therefore the experience is just unenjoyable. So they just like playing single-player. Nothing wrong with that, but it's interesting that you hear that, because when you're in the multiplayer sphere, that's all you think that people do. He says, only the single player games are not as good as they used to be. I no longer buy games at the extortionate prices that they charge, and the content is piss poor. Offering a story-based single player in which players themselves can create content for uploading for other players to play is something that isn't done. It kind of is done though, when you think about it, because look at City Skylines. It's it is a massively single player game, and it has a gigantic ton of mods and content, and the same is happening as well with Planet Coaster more and more and more. So it does exist, but I will say it isn't maybe like the widest thing. Although if you get into Steam and you get into games and you get into PC gaming and mods, there's a lot of mods out there, so I would say it does exist. Anyway, he says, I love exploring, yet I don't love kill on sight. Bollocks, it's got no interest to me. I agree, kill on sight is actually an issue with some games as well, but that's a whole other topic. He says, I deal with a lot of people, and in all honesty, I really don't like people. So for me, single player games are great, as it means I can unwind and not deal with people at all. As for microtransactions, loot boxes that require payment, your fool and his money are easily separated. And I think that's always a pretty true statement to make. Okay, so lastly today, just before we go into the topic, Warner Child said on this last video, he said, Red Dead, that's going to be the indie game we're going to be playing in 2018. And I reply saying, will it? And the reason that I say this is because today's topic for this Below the Line is about Red Dead, and it's about, more specifically, Take-Two, the publisher of Red Dead and the publisher of GTA. So today, just when you thought that things couldn't get any worse, we are reminded that it is in fact 2017, and things can always get worse when you think that they couldn't. In a November 7th article with Gama Sutra, they highlighted that Take-Two Interactive, who publish games like Red Dead 2, GTA 5, Mafia 3, the Bioshock series, the Civilization series, XCOM, Max Payne, Borderlands, Evolve, and more. Now what happened was that Strauss Zelnick, who's the chief of Take-Two, he was reported on a conference call speaking to investors, and he was reported as saying, quote, the game industry is now all about recurrent consumer spending rather than game sales, and that the business once upon a time was a big chunky opportunity to engage for tens of hours or perhaps hundreds of hours. That has turned into ongoing engagement, day after day, week after week. You fall in love with these titles and they become part of your daily life. And you think, well, that's good, that sounds right. And when you're hearing from people who are the head of these big publishers, it gives us a strong look as to where we're probably going to be going with upcoming titles like Red Dead Redemption 2, and this is everything that I've been recently saying. Just like games are part of our daily lives, so microtransactions will also become part of our daily gaming lives. Isn't that wonderful? Strauss continues in saying that we've said that we aim to have recurrent consumer spending opportunities for every title that we put out at this company. Every title. It may not always be an online model, it probably won't always be a virtual currency model, but there will always be some ability to engage in an ongoing basis with our titles after release across the board. He says that's a sea change in our business. Recurrent consumer spending is 42% of our net booking in this quarter. It's been transformative for us. It was also reported this week that Ubisoft's microtransactions now brought in more revenue than digital game sales alone for the first 2 quarters of this fiscal year. Microtransactions made up 51% of Ubisoft's digital sales. This includes in-game item sales, DLC, and season passes. That is a jump up of 83% for them. Now, that does include DLC, which I don't think many people would really consider as microtransactions, but they are part of digital revenue. That is not the game release in and of itself, and I think some people have fractured feelings still about just DLC, depending on the game and how it's being split or broken down. Now, back to Take-Two, and Strauss Zelnick isn't done yet. He continues saying, one of the things we've learned is if we create a robust opportunity and a robust world which people can play delightfully in a bigger and bigger way, they're going to keep coming back. They're going to engage. And there is an opportunity to monetize that engagement. He says there's a lot of room for growth. This is just the beginning. So if you needed any more evidence of what I've been saying, there it is. Chief of one of the world's biggest publishers stating that the current state of monetizing games post-release is only the beginning. So, you know, if you don't think that games like Battlefield are going to have this stuff proliferated throughout them, if you don't think that Red Dead 2 is going to have this stuff all over it, you're sadly mistaken. Guys, tell me your thoughts as always down below. Next episode of Below the Line will be coming up next week.